if we just collected the average amount of tax, we'd be collecting an extra $130 billion a year.
$130 billion.
The Labor Party famously said, we can't even fund good ideas. Well, there's a reason we can't do that. It's because we're a low-tax country.
One for mum, one for dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, I'm Ebony Bennett and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. Australia is a rich country, but more often than not, we don't act like it.
Choices matter. And the Australian government collects more money from HECS than it does from the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax. Thank you, children. You're the backbone of our economy, not the gas industry.
Budgets are about choices, and too often our governments choose to collect less tax than other developed nations. Multinational gas exporters, for example, are reaping billions from Australian resources, but according to data released by the Australian Taxation Office last week, many paid little or no tax. Again. But it's not just the gas industry. The ATO data shows that 30% of large corporations didn't pay any company tax. Joining me today to talk about our tax system and how we can make it fairer is the Australia Institute senior economist Matt Grudnoff. G'day, Matt.
G'day, Eb. Thanks for chatting with me again.
My absolute pleasure. But before we start, I did just want to talk about, Australians need a tax system that fits the needs of our community. And on Wednesday, the 29th of October at Parliament House in Canberra, the Australia Institute is hosting our Revenue Summit to discuss how to make that happen. For podcast listeners, you can use the code PODCAST to get 50% off the ticket price. That means just $75 plus a booking fee to hear from some great speakers, including former Queensland Premier, the Honourable Stephen Miles MP, Australian Greens leader, Senator Larissa Waters, Senator David Pocock, Dr. Kate Chaney MP, and more. The discount is available while tickets last, so get yours via the link in the show notes. So, Matt, I wanted to start out with what exactly we're talking about here. When we talk about the ATO finding out how many companies paid zero tax, what kind of data set are we talking about here?
So basically, once a year, the ATO releases the Tax Transparency Report, which is a report that shows big companies with a turnover of more than 100 million. It basically tells us how much they earned in revenue, how much taxable income they had, or profit they made, basically, and how much tax they paid. And what it shows is that about 30% of all of these big companies paid absolutely no tax. And guess what? The gas industry was big among them. You'd be surprised, I'm sure, about that, Eb.
Yes, having not talked about that much at all on this podcast. But I did, want to explore a few ideas that come up pretty regularly when we look at tax figures like these. The first one I want to ask about is, does the Australian economy have a backbone, Matt, and is it the fossil fuel industry?
Well, if the fossil fuel industry is the Australian economy's backbone, then, we're very jelly-like because look, the fossil fuel industry, they employ few people. They pay, as we've seen in this most recent report, they pay very little tax. What they are really, really good at is making profits. And because they're mostly foreign-owned, those profits flow overseas. So they don't give a lot to the Australian economy. They do make rich shareholders overseas a little bit more rich.
And just looking specifically at the gas industry, as you said, always pretty poor performers, but how did they fare this year?
Well, quite a number of them paid no tax. So ConocoPhillips, which works out of Gladstone, those huge gasification plants up there, paid no tax. Santos, the really big South Australian gas producer, no tax. Impex, which runs the new gas facilities near Darwin in the Northern Territory, no tax. Woodside, Northwest Shelf, a little bit of tax. So if you kind of add them all up, basically they earned, hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue, and they paid, just those ones I mentioned there, about $6 billion in tax. You're talking about a tiny percentage of their overall revenue.
Essentially, we've got a market that is broken, and essentially that comes down to an over-reliance on expensive gas. Australia's been linked to the export price for gas for some time, and now we're hostage to sky-high prices.
The driving factor behind this crisis that we're seeing at the moment is obviously the war, but also the fact that most of the gas gets exported, often overseas tax-free.
The gas cartel often tell us that there's a shortage of gas in Australia. That is simply a lie, and it's the basis that they use to make profit.
And as you said, profits for that time, the revenue that they were generating was a huge amount. The data was for the 2023-2024 financial year. You know about what was happening with gas prices during that time?
Yeah, so after the invasion of Ukraine, gas prices almost tripled. They had come down a little bit by the 2023-24. They were actually only about double what they were before the invasion of Ukraine. So they were still really, really high. So you've got to remember this is a time when the gas industry is incredibly profitable. But despite that, they're still paying very little tax. They are very good at avoiding tax, and they continue to do so, even though they're earning billions and billions.
So if the tax system was working as intended, these companies, when they're raking in those windfall profits, we should be seeing a dramatic increase along with that in revenue. That would be how it would work in an ideal world, right?
Absolutely. So company tax, the tax we're talking about now, is based on profit. Surely at a time when gas prices are sky high and we're exporting enormous amounts, that's the very time that these big companies should be making enormous profits. And look, their revenues are certainly enormous, and they seem to be earning these profits. But because of the various accounting tricks that they have, because of how they've set up their investment in building their infrastructure, how they structure themselves internationally, what they're managing to do is actually avoid paying, for many of them, any tax at all.
Is the coal industry in a similar boat? How does it compare to gas?
The coal industry pays a bit more tax than the gas industry, despite the fact that it actually makes a lot less profit, or at least a lot less revenue. But again, like other fossil fuels, like gas, they don't pay a great deal of tax. So the coal industry did pay a little bit of tax, but compared to their revenues, it was also really small. So what we see again and again and again, particularly with fossil fuel mining, not so much with other miners, and we might talk a bit about that later, but the fossil fuel miners are really good at avoiding tax, and coal and gas are the classic examples of that.
An industry that plays such a critical role. My government supports jobs, we support regional economic development, and we support sustainability. And this industry has a vital role to play.
I think the vast amount of Tasmanians, 90% of us, want to see better regulatory environment and perhaps a better revenue-raising environment from our salmon industry as well.
If we are not going to draw a line in the sand to save world heritage, when will we?
The workers aren't at fault here, it's the big corporate bosses who are at fault, and the political establishment who for decades have allowed big corporations to effectively self-regulate. That's the problem here, it's state capture.
We also saw the Prime Minister intervene to weaken Australia's environment laws just before the election to protect the salmon industry in particular, really talking up its contribution to the economy. How much tax did the salmon industry pay this year?
Very, very little. So there are 3 big salmon producers in Tasmania. They are now all foreign owned, and all of them, one of them, paid a little bit of tax. The other 2 paid none at all. And that was despite the fact that their revenue went up. So again, another industry that is really good at avoiding paying tax at the same time as putting a lot of pressure on the environment. So what these companies, gas, coal and salmon, all have in common is is they put a lot of pressure on the Australian environment and the world environment, but they give back very little. And also that they're largely foreign owned. So even though their sort of biggest contribution, if you like, is profit, that profit flows overseas. So you'd think that if Australia wanted to extract the most out of these industries, if it's not getting it from profit, they're small employing industries that pay, so that there's not many people who get a job out of this. So the only real benefit that Australians can extract from this is tax, and yet we are failing to tax them properly. The salmon industry is largely avoiding tax. The coal industry is largely avoiding tax, and the gas industry, who takes the gold medal in tax avoidance, is also largely avoiding tax.
So, I mean, there must be lots and lots of companies around Australia who are paying tax. Who are the big companies actually paying, or the big industries actually paying, the correct amount of tax in Australia?
Yeah, so Rio, BHP and Fortescue, all miners, are the biggest three taxpayers in 23-24, biggest company taxpayers. And what's interesting is none of them are involved in Australia in coal or gas. They're involved mostly in iron ore, but in all kinds of other mining pursuits. So it's not mining per se we're getting from this report that is sort of companies that are avoiding tax. It's actually fossil fuel miners in particular. So those big miners are the biggest taxes. The other big taxes in Australia, or big taxpayers, are the banks. Nobody should be surprised there. There's another company that's making, or an industry, I should say, that's making huge profits. And we see Commonwealth, Westpac, and NAB in particular in the top 10, and ANZ just outside of it. So they're paying enormous amounts of tax as well. And what these industries, I suppose, have in common is they're what economists call oligopolies. That is, they're in industries where there's only a few firms, and those firms dominate the industry and have lots of market power. So if you're a miner and you have exclusive rights over a particular iron ore deposit or a particular gold deposit or whatever it happens to be, nobody else can mine that. You have basically a big monopoly over that. The banks dominate the banking industry and are able to earn huge profits because of it. And so that's the reason we're seeing big tax. And you'd actually expect under the Australian system, it's really good that they're paying tax, right? So what we should be doing, particularly for oligopolies, is taxing them more, because effectively those taxes are coming from ripping people off. We see the banks making enormous profits. That's coming from Australians with mortgages, Australians with bank accounts. So we should be taxing those because they're able to use their market power.
He's vowed to impose new tariff and export restrictions on advanced tech and semiconductors.
The president posting on Truth Social that dozens of nations are using digital service taxes to discriminate against American tech companies like Meta, Alphabet, and Amazon.
Bloomberg reporting has found that Mark Zuckerberg was lobbying President Trump on digital taxes before he launched another tariff threat. What can you tell us about that? Who knew that lobbying works?
Matt, talking there about highly profitable companies and some of the biggest companies and how they've got oligopolies. We certainly know big tech operates in quite a similar way. What do we know about how much tax the big tech companies paid?
Yeah, well, big tech companies, not surprisingly, made billions and billions in revenue from Australia. So if we just look at Netflix, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Amazon, all of those were in this new tax transparency report, and collectively they made $25 billion over that year, 2023-24. But they only paid less than $500 million in tax. So that's only 2% of their revenue. Now, remember, tax is based on profit, not on revenue. But what tech companies in particular are great at doing is taking revenue and shifting it. It's called profit shifting. So they don't like paying tax in Australia or other, developed countries that have fair tax rates. They like to pay it in tax havens. They like to move it around. And that's exactly what we're seeing in this tax transparency report. We're seeing the big tech companies making tens of billions of dollars in revenue, but only paying a tiny fraction, 2% of that, in tax. And I mean, there was a big move for about a decade or about 15 years that tech companies should pay more. And there was a lot of movement, particularly through the OECD, an international organisation was basically coordinating this in order to get them to pay more tax. And we were looking at minimum rates of tax, which meant that, if firms could move their profits around, they still had to pay some minimum rate of tax. But since the election of Trump, Trump's basically said, nah, don't like that at all. These are American companies and, I'm not going to put up with other countries taxing these companies. And he's basically threatened tariffs on companies who do crack down on these big tech companies. So while I was hopeful previously that we might see more tax being extracted from these kind of tech companies, we might not see as much, particularly as Trump is president.
And overall, how important is the corporate tax rate to Commonwealth revenue? How much of it comes from companies paying company tax?
Yeah, so it's reasonably important. There are 3 taxes that dominate the Commonwealth revenue stream. That's income tax, company tax, and the GST. And income tax is by far the largest. It's almost half of all Commonwealth revenue. If you add in the GST, so individual income tax and the GST, that's 60%. Another 20% is company tax, so that gets us to 80%. So those 3 taxes make up 80%. But most of that comes from individuals, right? So you and I pay GST. Companies get their GST refunded. You and I pay income tax. The actual companies only pay 20% of that. So while it's one of the big taxes, it's actually small compared to the overall revenue stream. And given that competition is going down in Australia, right? Given that firms are becoming more and more profitable because they're able to exploit their market power, one silver lining in sort of falling competition, and to be clear, it's only a very small silver lining, is we should actually be collecting more and more revenue from that. And yet we don't seem to be able to really exploit this as much as we should. With less competition, they're making bigger profits. We should be getting more company tax, not less.
So could we increase that overall proportion either by increasing the rate of tax that we charge companies or by, as you say, ensuring that more of them are paying some kind of minimum? What are some other ways that we could be increasing the revenue from companies?
Yeah, so perhaps the rate isn't where we should start. It's the fact that it's based on profit. And that's always been a problem with company tax. So, when you and I pay income tax, it's not based on how much money we have left over at the end of the fortnight just before we get paid again. It's not based on our profit, like our savings, if you like. It's based on how much we earn. That's not the case with companies, right? It's based on not on how much they earn, but how much extra they get. So once they've paid all their bills, right, what have they got left over? Their profit. That's what the tax is based on. And so firms are in this constant battle to try and earn as much profit like for their shareholders, but not in tax terms, not taxable profit, if you like. And so that's really where gains can be made. And this report is actually a really interesting report. The Tax Transparency Report is something that's been around for just over a decade now. I think this is the 11th report they've put out. And I was actually at the Australia Institute before it came out, and I remember we were part of the fight to bring this about. It's called the Transparency Report because the thought was if we could publish the information about how much these big companies paid in tax, then people could look it up and they would talk about it each year. And effectively, we could put pressure on companies in order to force them into, or shame them in part, but also to change rules and put pressure on politicians to force them to pay more tax. And this year, despite the fact that 28% of these big companies paid no tax, that's actually the lowest rate ever we've had so far in all of the reports. So this is having an effect.
Is that right? So it's less than previous years?
Yeah, exactly right. So even though it's 30% and you'd think, wow, 30% or 28%.
Because I heard that, I thought that was outrageous, but it's actually better. Yeah. It's an improvement.
So look, we have a long way to go, to be clear, but it is great to see that sunlight actually works. And I remember when this was coming in, there was all kinds of claims about how, one of the most fanciful claims that the reason we couldn't publish this information is it would make the sort of owners and CEOs of these companies a kidnap risk. If we knew how much profit they were making and how much tax they were paying in revenue, then they might, become kidnap risks. And we had crazy wild, basically, as these big companies were trying desperately to hide what they were doing. So it is good to see this transparency report. We have further to go. We need more transparency, and we need better rules in order to capture these firms or prevent these firms from shifting profits, because as 30% is still too high. But it is at least a step, and over the last decade, it has borne fruit.
So, Matt, we've talked about how we could probably make sure that corporate taxes make up a bigger proportion of our tax take. But how does Australia compare overall with the amount of taxes we collect compared to other countries, basically?
Yeah, look, we are a very low tax country compared to other OECD, which is the developed world. So these are the kind of rich countries. We are very, very low. I think we are the ninth lowest out of about 38 OECD nations. We are so low that if we just collected the average amount of tax, we are one of the richest countries in the world, in fact. But if we just had the average, we'd be collecting an extra $130 billion a year. So to put that in context,
billion.
Yeah, so we collect just over about 110 billion in company tax on its own. We would have to collect an extra $130 billion in tax. And, and that would just make us average. One of the big problems that we see facing Australia is we always feel poor, like we're always worried about, the government can't do the good things that it wants to do. In fact, the Labor Party famously said, we can't even fund good ideas.
I can't tell you, as Finance Minister, I probably get 100 good ideas for one that we can do. And there's enormous restraint in this budget.
Well, there's a reason we can't do that. It's because we're a low tax country. And if we had, just an average tax rate, then we would have an extra $130 billion a year to spend, and we wouldn't feel this poor. We could have high-quality healthcare. We could have dental in Medicare. You could get bulk billed. You could have, a top-quality education system where everybody, no matter whether your parents are rich or poor, you got a high-quality education. We could have great infrastructure where our cities were connected together. We could have thriving public housing where lots of people could be housed. If we pumped more money into public housing, we could have affordable housing. All of these things stem from the fact that we don't collect enough tax.
I guess those are all the amazing things that Australians hear that we can't afford all the time.
Yep.
So what kind of policies, Matt, would help us get to that place where we're collecting enough revenue to fund, I guess, the services that Australians have come to expect from government?
Yeah, so people hear, well, we're a low tax country, and they kind of think, well, I'm paying a lot of tax. And they're actually right. Most sort of low and middle income earners, when we compare to other OECD countries, are actually pretty average. They are paying their fair share. Who's not paying their fair share? Well, in particular in Australia, the fossil fuel industry in particular. So, we are very lucky in many ways, or a lot of other countries might think that we're lucky because we have lots of resources. What we do really badly is taxing those resources, right? So we don't tax our mining companies, particularly our fossil fuel companies, and particularly our gas companies. Well, yeah, apparently we could have enormous amounts of revenue coming in by taxing gas exports, for example. We could tax wealth. And when I say tax wealth, we're talking about like the top few percent. If you just put a 2% tax on people who have net assets of more than $5 million, you could raise tens of billions of dollars, about $40 billion a year. So if you just tax the top end, and in Australia, the top end are the ones who aren't paying their fair share. If we just tax them properly, we could raise this extra $130 billion and not hit average Australians, not hit normal people earning an average wage. We could have better facilities, we could have better services just by taxing the top end better.
Thanks so much for coming on the show, Matt. You can join us at the Australia Institute's Revenue Summit on Wednesday, the 29th of October at Parliament House in Canberra, and use the code podcast to get 50% off the ticket price. Available while tickets last. This episode was recorded on Wednesday, the 8th of October. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.